In just the past few years, 11 countries around the world have defaulted. And depending how you measure it, somewhere between 48 and 54 nations are either in or at risk of debt distress. That includes over 60% of Africa's low-income countries. As interest rates in the West continue to rise and the dollar strengthens, pressures on countries ranging from Argentina to Ethiopia to Ukraine are only going to intensify. Yet, disputes between the Western nations that make up the Paris Club, China, which has rapidly become the most important lender to the developing world, and commercial bondholders, has held up efforts to restructure and write off unsustainable debts. As one analyst has said, this may not turn into a global debt crisis as in the 1980s, but it is already creating a development crisis, one in which the cost of servicing debts is crowding out spending on urgent needs, from alleviating poverty to boosting growth to addressing the climate crisis. Heidi, let me start with you, if I may. 3 years ago, the G20 agreed on a common framework meant to speed up debt resolution talks because of all these new players that were now involved. 3 years later, none of the countries have actually made it through the program successfully. Sri Lanka and Zambia are getting closer, but we're still not there yet. Why is it taking so long? What's the main roadblock?
So, I think one of the important points is that you already flagged. We have a lot of new players that are around the table, and some are not happy about the table that was there previously, which is the Paris Club. We need to actually get through the debt distress question urgently because there are pressing needs for poor countries in particular to actually move on and avail themselves of some of the new forms of support that are making themselves available. But I think the process is not going well. The common framework has not proven a format that has been conducive to actually the restructuring that we need to see. I think there are several reasons. One, we've had a lack of transparency that has sort of plagued the process. So if you don't have full transparency from all creditors about what the terms and conditions are, how much debt, what is the maturity profile, what is is there collateral involved? And that is actually a serious challenge. We need China in particular to be a constructive participant in the debt negotiations for poor countries. And when I say transparency, I would flag just last night, there was a news story about how aid data found 20 billion additional dollars that China had lent to Pakistan, not 21 billion that they've lent, 21 billion in addition to the 40 plus billion that the World Bank actually had as the disclosed amount of debt from China to Pakistan. So you can't have surprises like that. If you're the IMF, you can't start with a baseline fundamental analysis of how sustainable a debt profile can be if you don't have the full information. The second, you need to have everybody around the same table. If you have a participant that has a go-it-alone strategy, which we've kind of seen, the IMF and the world around the table can't be there to provide funding or debt relief if that money is going to be rechanneled and just repaid to one creditor. And that one creditor that we've seen that happen with is, particularly in the case of Suriname, is to China. And I would say the last thing is time. Time is not a friend here. We've had the common framework now for 3 years, and Zambia was the poster child. It was really the one where you had a new government come in. Everything was, the private bondholders, which are often a challenge in the process, actually formed a creditor committee right away. We're still, we just got through a threshold where there was an agreement that allowed the IMF to release some funding to Zambia. But I think 3 years is far too long. We don't have that amount of time. So transparency, not going it alone, and doing it much faster. We need it months, not years.
Got it. I'm pleased to announce that Vera is actually here, so she can join us on stage. That's wonderful. But maybe, Doug, in the meantime, maybe I can turn to you. If what Heidi is saying is true, welcome, by the way. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
If what Heidi is saying is true, does that suggest that the framework itself needs to be scrapped, and what would replace it if not?
Well, the framework doesn't need to be scrapped because there is nothing to replace it. The basic premise is if you have a series of different creditors, they all have to coordinate. The premise of comparability of treatment is a very difficult one to apply, but if you don't have people sitting around the table trying to get there in a collaborative way, the alternative is chaos. And you mentioned Sri Lanka in your opening comment. I'd say Sri Lanka is not a common framework country. And as a consequence, what we saw several weeks ago was what we thought was a coordinated effort between the Paris Club, non-Paris Club countries, the IMF, and China turned out to be not so coordinated after all, because since there was no common framework applied, China Exim Bank cut a separate deal to the surprise of the IMF and the other creditors, which meant the whole thing was paralyzed. And I go back to Heidi's point, which is unless there's a means by which this gets resolved constructively, the people who suffer are the countries that are the debtor countries that don't have access to other financing. The IMF is not there to provide funding that goes, as Heidi said, to the creditors that don't want to cooperate. It is there to provide financing to the people of the country to make them sustainable. And usually we demonize the private creditor group. It's usually, oh, those bad, greedy creditors. Turns out that what we've seen is a rather constructive engagement by bondholders and other private creditors in these cases. It has been the lack of coordination at the common framework or at the bilateral creditor committee, the official creditor committee level, that has been the big problem.
Excellent. So, Xiaoyang, you've heard this before, this criticism that China goes it alone, that it's not transparent. How would you explain its behavior? Is it being misinterpreted by the West?
Yeah, actually from what Heidi and Bob said, we can see exactly the problem, the lack of coordination and the lack of understanding. Because actually when China lended to these developing countries, it's actually basically a lot of lending goes from China's structure, like the China Exim Bank or China Development Bank. They actually lend a large part of their loans are commercial loans, and they follow the commercial rules internationally. So actually exactly also AIDA data last year or several years ago, they published this comparison. When you compare the China's loan to OECD, these official lenders, maybe some of this Exim Bank, they do not have the same transparency or the same also debt relief conditions. But however, when you compare it to the Gulf countries, to the international banks like Morgan Stanley or Citibank, actually their contract confidentiality just very similar. So that's actually what the Chinese system is different from the other, like the Paris Club. Also, when it comes to this undisclosed loans, that's again about the category. For example, in Zambia, some loans, they were loaned to the Zambian SOEs. And this actually up to this borrowing countries to report it or not. Yeah, it's actually, I think there's this understanding of borrowing countries. They may put it in which category. It's actually up to them. But then in a lot of media report, they simply then put this all to the China, so-called China as a whole. They actually didn't differentiate what's the real ODA or the real official bilateral or the actual commercial loans. All this actually, when you see from the Chinese perspective, these are all need to be classified differently. And the same is also for this debt relief effort and the common framework. And in fact, China is very actively taking part in this common framework. But it needs time. Actually, when the real urgent situation, like the COVID just happened, before the common framework, we had DSSI. And that part, actually, China was the largest contributor to the debt suspension and also this delay of payment. Right, but actually after that, then when it comes to common framework, we need to actually think about long term. Yeah, it's not so urgent like the 2020. So we actually need to solve the debt sustainability in the long run. And what China saw is actually in the 1980s, this debt crisis, and to the HIPC and then MDRI, this system, actually they didn't solve the fundamental problem. We see the debt crisis come back again. And especially a new player is also the commercial loans and the bond holders. And they actually also lack the consensus and coordination. So that's why even in DSSI, none of them really participated in it. Right? So I think for these 3 years, China actually worked with all the different partners to work out a coordination, really aim for sustainability. And I'm glad to see actually this year in June, China reached an agreement in Paris about the Zambian debt. And that's a very positive first step. And then also last month, we also see the private bondholders in Zambia reached a similar agreement, like what China did. These are all, I think, very encouraging, positive steps for the future.
China, we were talking earlier, China, as you mentioned, in its economic reforms, takes a step-by-step approach, right? Experimenting, gradualist, as it were. Do you see something similar happening with their approach to debt restructuring? Are they learning from their mistakes?
Yeah, certainly. So for China, I think there is actually always has been change in the lending process and in cooperation with the BRI countries. So they, in fact, the so-called debt trap, that's exactly an experiment because they saw there's a lot of debt burden on Sri Lanka at that time. So they wanted to do a PPP, so private-public partnership, to turning it to share. But what's actually China didn't expect is this normal PPP actually encouraged by World Bank and lost a lot of international community. But it was actually accused by Indian, by also Western later as a debt trap. So that actually then make China to change it again. And I think in this post-COVID time, with this high interest rate, China is definitely thinking about a new approach to lend and also to fund the development. Maybe it won't be the pure commercial loans as before. It actually a lot of is investment, and also another thing is about how to create a more sustainable lending environment. It's not totally follow the market. Actually, we see in good times, like the low interest rate, actually the developing countries benefit a lot from that and get a lot of loans. But now in high interest rate, then the developing countries also suffer most. So I think China maybe want to mitigate this fluctuation to make it more sustainable.
Okay, Vera Songwe mentioned the new interest rate environment. We're talking about debt, but is the focus misplaced? I mean, it's oftentimes when we look at poorer countries and their debt problems, we almost assume that it's a character flaw, right? That there's some poor macroeconomic fundamentals to blame. The solution is to bring in the IMF to show them how to do things properly. But we wouldn't treat richer countries or banks the same way if they faced a temporary liquidity shortage. Are we misinterpreting what some of the problems are for these countries?
I think the short answer is yes. The long answer is I think we need to be able to, first of all, sorry, and greetings to everybody, and thank you for the Bloomberg New Economic Forum for having me here. Had late flights and difficult coming in. But going back to the conversation, I think two things. We must split the countries, right? We have countries with poor macroeconomic fundamentals, and those are a different set of countries. Those need eventually some conversation around debt, restructuring and how one does that. And then we have countries with good macroeconomic fundamentals that have been hit by mostly exogenous shocks. And what we are seeing is, I would say, a disproportionate response to emerging and low-income economies and developed economies, and actually corporates. If anybody read the FT 2 days ago, there was a story about sort of, never before have we seen as many corporates in trouble because of rising interest rates, and what should we do about it? Otherwise, there will be an unraveling. I think that what you're looking at is some economies in the developing and low-income countries that need liquidity because they have bullet payments coming. So if you look at a Kenya, for example, or even a Rwanda last year, right? Rwanda had a 750 billion bullet payment that was coming due. And then there was all this, debt distress and debt crisis, but they were able to restructure that and go back into growth. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to be looking at, is countries that have good macroeconomic fundamentals, but that have a liquidity crunch. Should we begin to institute a system where we can actually help them get over that? And we have seen developed economies, central banks, provide this kind of, not lender of the last resort, but liquidity provider of the last resort. And the IMF should begin to do a little bit more of that. There is actually, I think the IMF is coming around to this notion. I've been talking about it now for 2 years, saying, we need liquidity stopgaps. Because if we talk about liquidity too long, we get into insolvency, and then we get into debt, right? And then everybody says, there's a debt problem. But it really begins with a short-term liquidity problem that can be solved. 2024 is going to be very important for a lot of emerging and low-income countries, because we do have over $16 billion of bullet payments coming due. And the decision between whether it's going to be a liquidity event or it's going to be a debt default problem is going to be quite important. Now, what I have been recommending is that because the G20 Common Framework is taking so long and not sort of getting to where we need it to get to, maybe what we need to do is do a debt service suspension initiative over a 5-year period, which will give us time to be, because essentially what that does is it puts liquidity back into the hands of countries and allows them then to manage their fiscal space better. And that will allow us then to be able to sort of restructure the G20 Common Framework in a way that works well. But we cannot, and I think in an environment where we see repeated crises, be trying to ask countries to wait until we figure out how to solve or fix the G20 Common Framework. I think this is too expensive and too costly for any economy to wait. We have a solution, which is maybe to reenact the DSSI for another, not 2 years, but 5 years, so that countries really have the time to adjust and essentially deal with the liquidity problem while we go ahead and fix the G20 Common Framework.
Who would be the backstop here? Would it be the IMF, or would it be...
It will be the IMF again. I think with the DSSI, what we had was essentially bilaterals and the IMF. I think Heidi was just talking about net reflows. If you look at what is happening today, the other big issue with debt is not so much, I think there's a lot of focus on debt, but your debt to GDP, which is the ratio that we look at, or your debt to exports, really also depends on your growth. And I don't think there is enough of a conversation around growth. The easiest, fastest, best, most sustainable way of dealing with the debt problem is to help countries grow. And we're talking about a green economy and the huge opportunities that digitization and green economies can provide. And my sense is, as opposed to spending 3.5 years discussing Zambia's debt, if we had put Zambia into an electric vehicle supply chain because they have the necessary raw commodities, they will start growing out of it. We saw a little bit of that with Chad, right? We said Chad was about to get into, they actually got into debt default, and then commodity prices skyrocketed. Glencore said, hey, I'm not really discussing this debt, prices are high, they can pay me back. And so essentially, I think that if there is growth, as we've seen, we will begin to deal with this debt issue much faster and in a much more sustainable way.
Doug, did you?
Just a comment on the DSSI, which was very well intentioned. The technical aspects of the DSSI include two things. One, it is NPV neutral, which means you can extend that debt suspension period for 2 years, 5 years, whatever it is. But by its design, explicitly, it says the net present value of that debt will not change, which means the countries may get a slight liquidity breather, but in fact, their overall debt burden doesn't go away. It's actually just pushed down the road, which I would argue is not necessarily a solution. It's a stopgap at best. But the second point is, from a private creditor perspective, that's a default. If you are forced,
the private creditors never participated, and I actually worked with the IIF when the DSSI was put out so that we could write a letter to all countries based on Tim Adams, thank God for him, got all the private creditors to agree that they will not consider the DSSI as an event of default when it happened.
But it wasn't up to the IIF, and the IIF's position has changed over time precisely because the initial goodwill expressed in that initial letter was eroded by the private creditors who actually hold the debt, who said, that's nice that Tim and the IIF agreed to this, we don't. And the credit rating agencies didn't go along, and they said, if you go along, we're going to declare you in some form of
But
default.
they never did. No credit rating
But that's
agency
because the DSSI
actually did.
The DSSI
No,
never
I think we have to
actually
be
took
very
hold.
clear about what we are saying. No credit rating agency actually declared any country that took a DSSI into a situation of default. At least this is true.
There were a number of countries that did not go into the DSSI because they were told if they did, they would be declared in default.
No, no country that went into the DSSI was declared in default.
But they were afraid. You're saying that they were afraid that might
They
happen.
may have been afraid, but none of them that did it went into default. The only Moody's said, we will put you on the watch. So a country like Cote d'Ivoire, let's be concrete, a country like Cote d'Ivoire actually took the DSSI, gave itself some fiscal space and breathing room, was able to restructure its debt, and actually went back to the markets. Ghana, on the contrary, never took the DSSI and went into default. So I actually believe that any country that was able to take the DSSI and did not take the DSSI made a mistake.
Could I pick up on one thing that that Vera mentioned in terms of the growth aspect of this? Because I think one of the to tie together some of those recommendations with what's happening in the next platform, which is this global the global debt sustainability roundtable that does pull together. It's kind of the next table that we're trying to advance the ball that goes beyond just the poorest countries and captures, for example, Sri Lanka. There are some good creative ideas that are out there on linking some of the new types of debt restructuring mechanisms to the ability of future growth, linking to future growth, which is somewhat problematic because you have to choose what growth metric you're going to use. But also, if there are a commodity-based economy, if you have fluctuations in price, that the restructuring can reflect the positive and the negative of the fluctuation in commodity prices, and also for climate resilience. That if there is a natural disaster, if there is a shock, that could be linked to the restructuring process as well. So I think there's a lot of creative thought. We do need to get past the residual challenges in the countries that are the poorest that are facing debt distress right now, because I think the idea would be to move forward as quickly as possible and open up the opportunity to actually provide the kind of financial support, grants as opposed to loans, concessional funding where it's available to the poorest countries who are also facing the worst challenges of climate, of health and education, and actually really need to benefit from this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this brings up a good point. Whether we're talking about debt, liquidity, the problem is still the same. These countries don't have access to the funding that they need to address these urgent problems. I mean, Africa right now, African nations are spending 5 to 15% of their GDP on climate shocks, even though they've contributed barely 4% to global emissions. Is there a framework going forward that can make these debts sustainable, that can provide them the money that they need?
So I think as Doug mentioned, that global roundtable was really meant to be that next step where you had private creditors, you had some borrowing countries, you had the MDBs, you had the IMF. And individual bilateral creditors around a table to try and be as constructive as possible. And I think I think we need to find some kind of a table that we're all willing to constructively work around. That was sort of the latest, the latest attempt. So I think if we try and make that work, then we have some promise. The IMF, World Bank, new leadership at the bank really focused on this. The EU is focused on this, GCC is focused on this, US is focused on this. Everybody's focused on getting past this debt distress issue so that we can provide the kind of financing and funding and grants to countries that actually really need it right now.
Xiaoyang, let me come back to you. Vera was talking about growth and green supply chains, right? China has talked about wanting to make its Belt and Road more green, move away from some of the big, huge infrastructure loans that they've traditionally made. And separately at home, domestically, is developing very powerful green supply chains. Is there a way to bring these countries into those value chains?
Yes, certainly. I think that's the Chinese approach to work on this debt stress issue. Actually, China says the fundamental problem is not to provide more concessional loans, but actually to make the productivity higher. And in fact, we see for the last 5 years, this green industrialization across the world actually creates quite a lot of chance for Africa and for other developing countries. So I think, however, we need to also see the difference between the developed countries and the developing countries. In developed countries, you may have the energy transition from traditional to the green ones and these EV cars. But actually, for a lot of developing countries, like yesterday, the South Africa minister said, actually, for Africa, the first problem is how we get energy. And they do not even have the alternative for the cheaper ones. Right, so for them, actually, to get the industrialization is actually the first step. And China sees the chance of green industrialization in these countries as you may have the leapfrog effect. Right, when you do not need to go through all this coal and this fossil fuel stage, but you can directly try to build a much advanced, less polluting power plant. But to which extent should that follow the Western and advanced standard? That's actually China will see that concretely. And also that's the Chinese difference maybe from this discussion style in Washington, because what the U.S. government or IMF, they tend to discuss, but often with the established rules, which was established by the West. And China, in its own development practice, it sees rather the diversity of all the countries' conditions. And China knows now we are in this globalization stage, which should not simply follow the older existing rules. There are so many different new situations on the ground. So Chinese, that's why I think that's also related to your previous question. Go to the ground and experiment and find out what's the most sustainable and beneficial in the long run. Actually, China thinks the debt stress can only be solved when you really promote the industrialization and development in these countries. Then the productivity will take over, will overpass this debt interest rate. This will be the solution. Otherwise, all just this suspension and concession loans will just solve short-term problems.
Just put off the problem. Vera, you've written the scale of the funding needs here is massive, right? Among emerging nations outside of China, I think you wrote that spending on climate preparations has to quadruple by 2030, $2.4 trillion a year in the emerging world. Debt alone is not going to be able to address this need, right? So what else is there? Are there other innovations out there for non-debt financing that these countries can access?
A number of things that are happening, and I think maybe I just address your point quickly. I think we need to distinguish between the stock and the flow, right? We have $150 billion right now of, at least Africa has $150 billion worth of debt due to China, and one needs to sort of deal with that stock. And then there is a flow issue, which is sort of what do we do and how do we contract new debt and how do we organize it? And I think some of this discussion is around that, and that's where the new solutions are coming from. One of them is really looking inward. and working with pension funds and long-term patient capital within the continent. Because the whole point is seeing how one can generate long-term, affordable patient capital to actually do long-term investments, right? And hitherto, we didn't really have a lot of sort of conversations with national and regional pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. We're beginning to see that. I think last year in Togo, 18 continental pension funds came together to create a fund of funds that is going to start doing investments. And I think that is learning a little bit from the East Asia examples and, Singapore and others that have grown out of pension funds. Because one of the issues has been that because Africa doesn't have, and this is the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility that I created, Africa doesn't have secondary markets for its paper. And so what happens is a lot of the conversation on debt is because it's the cost of borrowing. Today, the IMF says that we have about 24 to 30 countries, emerging and low-income economies worldwide, that are accessing markets at 700 to 900 basis points. So if I'm borrowing where I have to pay 90 cents on the dollar when I borrow, and somebody else has to pay 20 cents on the dollar, clearly I'm going to get into debt default, much, much faster because I'm paying 90 cents for every dollar that I borrow. And that is the point. And part of it is because we don't have secondary markets. We have been able to, as emerging and low-income countries, go to the capital markets without building the underlying infrastructure that is needed to be able to bring down some of this cost. And so the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility that I created is like a repo market. You can actually, once you buy a sovereign wealth bond from a country, you can repo it, which means you can resell it, you can make it more liquid, which attracts a totally different class of asset managers into those markets, brings more capital in, creates more competition, and drives down prices. But we need a lot more of this sort of capital markets regulation to make sure that that works. Another very important point that is happening is, Basel regulation now says if you lend to emerging and low-income countries, because the risk is higher, your liquidity coverage ratio has to be higher. And we have now segmented what we call high-quality liquid assets. And it's different high-quality liquid assets for emerging and low-income and for developed countries, which makes it even more difficult. So we're now trying to put in legislation that will take that away. And I think these are some of the things that we hope that with sort of innovation will allow for, cheaper. Because the issue is debt is good if you use it well and if it's cheaper and long-term. Because that's the only way that you grow. Developing and development institutions, the World Bank and the IMF do not have enough resources for growth in these countries. So we have to go to markets. So the most important innovation has to be how we make markets more amenable and more accessible to these countries so that we can access the $136 trillion.
So on the one hand, as your question suggests, private capital is not only abundant, but it is potentially what we're looking to solve a lot of these funding issues. On the other hand, they tend to be seen as the poor stepchild when it comes to debt treatment, debt relief. They are outside of the room. They are told this is what you will take, but we're not going to give you a lot of transparency on why this is comparable to something that we're not going to disclose to you. They are demonized by a large portion of the political environment, certainly in the U.S. and elsewhere. So I think we need to decide whether private capital is the answer or the problem. Now, it's obviously both, but the way we attract private capital is to give them some fair due and say, yes, you're taking risk, you'll get paid for that risk. We might collectively, as the multilateral system, provide some floor on that risk. There's a lot of structures with which to do that, but I do think that there's this schizophrenia. So there are the trillions of dollars of private capital that can be used for development finance, for reconstruction finance, for a slew of uses. But we have to decide if we're actually going to work with them or not. And I'm not advocating that they're all good guys, because sometimes they're very self-interested, and that might not be in the interest of multilaterals or the debtor countries themselves. But I do think we have to decide whether we're going to treat them in a way that encourages them to come back to the table again and again, or if we just sort of say this is a one-off, let's punish everyone, you guys in particular, and then we just expect you'll be greedy enough to come back again later.
Right. Okay. I think on that note, we need to end things, but thank you all very much for being here. Thanks for making it.
Thank you.